Civil rights can be defined as personal rights guaranteed and protected by the U.S. Constitution and federal laws enacted by Congress. These rights include freedom of speech, the right to vote, due process of law, equal protection of the laws, and protection from unlawful discrimination. The civil rights movement started because African Americans were not receiving these rights promised to them in the Constitution. Africans were enslaved and brought to America, where over time they became African Americans. Millions of slaves were brought from Africa to America through the Middle Passage. Treatment of imprisoned blacks was notoriously inhumane, which makes sense because slaves were regarded to be only 3/5 of a human compared to a white male. The South was more dependent on slavery because of its reliance on agricultural income, while the North had less demand for slave labor due to the colder climate as well as emerging industrial revolution. Soon, the division of North and South led to the Civil War, which was a war that was fought to preserve the Union. However, Abraham Lincoln, the anti-slavery president of America, passed the Emancipation Proclamation as a strategic move to weaken the South. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves, but did not free blacks from the prejudice and social injustices that were cast upon them until the Civil Rights Movement.
Equality. I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but equality would be the biggest issue because even though African Americans were living at a lower standard of living than other Americans.
World War I influenced the civil rights movement because it unified the workforce and created demand for supplies that both white men and black men could produce, such as weapons.
Did you know that the X-Men movie is an analogy for the civil rights movement? It's true. In X-Men, the mutants are oppressed and represent black Americans during the civil rights movement. Professor X and Martin Luther King Jr. have similar beliefs because they believe the best way to fight oppression is with peace. Similarly, both Magneto and Malcolm X believe that they have the right to achieve equality by any means necessary, including violence. Malcolm X was an African-American Muslim minister and human rights activist. He once said, and I quote, "It doesn't mean that I advocate violence, but at the same time, I'm not against using violence in self-defense. I don't call it violence when it's self-defense. I call it intelligence." On December 1st of 1955, a black seamstress by the name of Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus to a white male. Rosa was arrested for refusing her seat. On the very same night, Joanne Robinson constructed a plan for a bus boycott. Robinson's boycott was only to last one day. As Martin Luther King Jr. was elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, he continued the boycott and success was imminent. The boycott was long and challenging, but it paid off. The bus segregation ordinance is declared unconstitutional. Blacks and whites no longer have assigned seats. This stepping stone in civil rights is what kick-started the civil rights movement. President Kennedy made it clear in his inauguration speech that he was a supporter of the civil rights movement. In 1962, James Meredith applied to the University of Mississippi. All within his constitutional rights, Meredith was accepted. Riots and protests broke out in Alabama in revolt to Meredith's enrollment. Kennedy immediately sent federal troops to the university to maintain order. Merely a year later, Dr. Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech at the Washington Monument. The speech only pushes the civil rights movement further. Following the speech, Congress passed the benchmark civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act made discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or origin unconstitutional. Congress would later expand on the legislation, making it more powerful and more efficient. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, outlawing any discrimination on voting rights. The lack of these laws is the reason African Americans had no representation in politics. In 1966, from the state of Massachusetts, Edward Brooke III is elected as the first black senator in 85 years. A year later, Thurgood Marshall is the first black to be named to the Supreme Court. Just as things seem to be going well for the movement, the father of civil rights, Martin Luther King, is assassinated in Memphis.
Of those who were active, I would say it was more a feeling of desperation. What worried our government more wasn't really their consciences as much as the threat of violence. And they were worried that there would be riots in the big cities. I think Martin Luther King's message of nonviolence had a big influence. He always was opposed to violence, but violence was always there, even at King's rallies. I think it was really about being treated fairly and with dignity.
Current civil rights issues we are facing is still the separation between blacks and whites. Blacks make up the majority of prison inmates, and 30% of blacks live under the poverty line. With so many black fathers in jail, children are born into broken families and fall into a vicious cycle of gang life and prison. Also, inner-city schools, populated mostly by black students, receive less funding than schools in the suburbs, populated by mostly white students, which makes it a lot harder for students in these inner-city schools to succeed and fulfill their potential in education.
Although we are still working towards total racial equality, it is evident that we have come very far since blacks were first brought to America via the Middle Passage. Our current president is African American. This is a symbol of progression and hope for the future. Thank you.